Adelante.
Okay. Muy buenos días a todos nuestros amigos y amigas que nos acompañan en la Cátedra Flacso México en su tercera edición del año 2022. Bienvenidas todas, bienvenidos todos. Hoy tenemos el enorme gusto y placer de que nos acompañe una académica distinguidísima, Deborah Yashar, de la Universidad de Princeton. Actualmente ella es directora del Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies y además es la Donald Stokes Professor of Public and International Affairs y profesora de política y asuntos internacionales en la misma universidad. Deborah ha hecho una muy interesante carrera de investigación y docencia. Ella se graduó en Berkeley, de ahí tiene su doctorado, también su maestría, aunque originalmente estuvo en la Universidad de Brown en relaciones internacionales y ha recibido una gran cantidad de reconocimientos y premios por sus publicaciones y por su trabajo, que es, a mi juicio, un trabajo excelente, innovador y que está abriendo horizontes muy importantes en la investigación de las ciencias sociales en términos generales, en términos teóricos y en la investigación sobre América Latina. Ella se ha especializado en temas de medio ambiente y economía, en temas de ciudadanía y democracia, y recientemente, a finales del año pasado, apareció un magnífico libro cuya lectura recomendamos y creo que ella hará girar la conferencia de hoy, que por cierto dará en inglés, aunque después en las preguntas y respuestas podríamos tener un intercambio en ambos idiomas, y creo que en francés también, porque ella habla francés. Entonces, simplemente presento el libro. El libro se llama, en español se llamaría El giro inclusivo en América Latina, The Inclusionary Turn in Latin America. Es un libro coeditado con Diana Kapisevsky y Steve Levitsky, editado por la Universidad de Cambridge. Y este libro es un libro interesantísimo porque analiza comparativamente lo ocurrido en el proceso de democratización latinoamericano, en la gran etapa que ha habido de democracia casi generalizada en todo el subcontinente, cómo en estos regímenes políticos democráticos se ha producido o no la inclusión social, la inclusión de los actores previamente excluidos en el pasado. Y hace un contrapunto muy interesante con un libro clásico de David y Ruth Collier sobre el mismo tema, pero que giró en torno a la época del inicio y el desarrollo del periodo de sustitución de importaciones, el sistema internacional de sustitución de importaciones que privó en el mundo y fuertemente en América Latina previo a los años 80, se desestructura hacia finales de los años 60 y 70 y da luego lugar a las reformas neoliberales que hemos tenido en los últimos 30 años o 40 años, dependiendo de cómo se mida. Si uno lo mide desde Chile, pues es mucho más tiempo, porque eso ocurre desde mediados de la década de los años 70 y posteriormente, principalmente en los años 80, en América Latina, se van aplicando estas políticas de ajuste económico que coinciden al mismo tiempo con la instauración de sistemas democráticos. Bueno, entonces, sin más, pues con esta presentación le agradezco a Deborah que nos acompañe el día de hoy y pues te doy la palabra, Deborah, bienvenida. Aquí tienes tu casa y muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy. Y bueno, let's switch to English because this is the language you are going to speak on. Okay, all right.
All right.
Go
Well,
on,
I just want to start off by saying thank you. Thank you so much, Francisco, for the invitation to speak with all of you, as we were saying before the start of this session. It would have been lovely if we were all actually in the same room to be able to speak face to face, but I'm so delighted that even in the context where that's not possible, that we can have this virtual conversation. So Francisco, thank you so much for this opportunity. I also want to thank Marcela in advance, since I know that you're going to be giving comments afterwards. So thank you for what I'm sure are going to be insightful and critical and difficult, but wonderful comments. And of course, everybody who made this possible behind the scenes, Norma, Fernando, Mariana, all of you who helped to make this happen going forward. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen. And before I do that, Francisco, am I coming through clearly?
Yes.
Okay, so
Perfectly.
I'm going to share my screen. Let's do this. All right, and the screen is clear now, correct?
Yes.
Good.
Yes,
all right.
That's correct.
All right, so let me tell you what it is I'm going to do today. As Francisco noted, I'm going to talk about the inclusionary turn in Latin America, and the picture on the left actually shows you the cover of the book. And I want to really start off by reiterating that what I'm going to share with you today is the effort of many people. In particular, I'm going to share the work that I've done with Diana Kapaszewski and Steve Levitsky, as noted by Francisco and on the cover here. But also, I want to share with you, before I, hold on, my screen is, hold on. Here we go. What I want to share with you is that the work that I'm going to talk about over the next little bit is focused primarily on chapter 1 of this book, but I want you to see the wealth of people who contributed, because Steve and Diana and myself really tried to encompass the work of all these folks who are part of this book. And most of us were ourselves students of David and Ruth Collier. So it was really appropriate, and Francisco noted, that we are engaging with the earlier work on the incorporation of labor and the working class in an earlier moment, but really trying to think about what is in play right now. So what I'll do is I'll give you an overview of this book, and I'll lay that out in a moment, but I want to highlight that while the book talks about the inclusionary turn in Latin America, of course, it's important to note that we are at a moment of great uncertainty, where in fact there have been enormous setbacks and challenges. So what I'm going to do for today's talk is to go through these 5 general points. And Francisco, please stop me if I'm going over, because there's always so much to say. First, I'll give an overview of what we mean by the inclusionary turn. I'll conceptualize it with you so you know what it is that we're talking about. We'll give you some data to highlight the trends and the arcs that we see that are in play. Talk about some explanations with some humility, because it's really a research agenda, and then end with concerning paradoxes and conclusions as noted here. Okay, so inclusionary turn. You'll see the red is highlighted on the screen for number 1. That's what I'm going to focus on here. The inclusionary turn in Latin America starts off with the observation that even though we are currently in a moment of backsliding, a moment that I will come back to at the end, if we travel the arc of the third wave of democracy, really thinking about 1979 through the 80s and the 90s into the early 2000s, we see that there has actually been what we refer to as the inclusionary turn, particularly if we focus on the 1990s and the acceleration of certain reforms in the 21st century. What did this entail? Let me tell you briefly, and then I'll go into more details. What we see, and what I'm sure you can also imagine as you think about this, that during this period, governments across the region of Latin America created institutions and policies that were really aimed not all, but the ones that we're focused on, in including previously excluded groups and expanding the boundaries of citizenship. So with that basic observation, what we tried to do is to look at the greater inclusion that occurs in 3 dimensions. I'll mention them here and come back to them. First, we look at states who took unprecedented steps to recognize groups that had been previously excluded. And so this would include work that I and also Marcela and others have worked on, looking at Indigenous people, Afro-Latin communities, multicultural and plurinational communities. There was a movement of recognizing groups that have previously been sidelined. Second, we feature and focus on new channels of access to policymaking that broaden the institutional channels for taking part and triggering what some scholars, Cameron and Sharp in particular, have referred to as an explosion of participation. We can talk about that, I'm sure, at the end. And finally, we see that even with the neoliberal reforms that significantly cut back social policies, as we all know. At the same time, there was an investment in other kinds of social policies that led to strikingly unprecedented coverage for women, the unemployed, the rural sector, and the informal poor. So the consequences of all this inclusionary turn that I'm going to unpack with you, is that we see an overall increase. Strikingly, it coincides with decline in poverty rates, at least at that initial moment. And in some cases, even a stronger enforcement of patterns that were on the books but had not been deployed. Now, why is it important to note this? Why is this remarkable? We think that the emergence of a more inclusive politics across Latin America marked during this earlier period a significant, and for us in many ways, an unexpected break with the past. Why is that? First of all, as we all know, Latin America is characterized on a global scale with particularly extreme patterns of inequality, arguably the most unequal region in the world. And of course, Brazil stands out in that domain in particular. So it's striking that in a context of inequality, although we'll flip that script a little bit later, you have a move towards inclusion. Second, in the context of neoliberal reforms, which were so consequential, had such enduring consequences for the region at a moment of economic crisis, of neoliberal reforms that demobilize sectors, that depoliticize citizens, and moreover, that cut back on basic welfare collective programs where corporate structures broke down. Left parties oftentimes moved closer to the center. There's an atomization and demobilization. We found it striking. In fact, when we started this project, we were surprised by how much inclusion on the books was happening, even in a context of the neoliberal reforms. So I just want to note this overall point that I'm going to unpack through the rest, is that we had not anticipated as much inclusionary formal politics as we saw on the books, especially in the context of inequality and especially in the context of neoliberal reforms that were so relevant. So let me step back then now and turn to the second point, which is, what do we even mean when we're talking about inclusion or the inclusionary turn going forward? What is inclusion here? All right. First, we understand inclusion, and again, I want to reiterate, this is work with Diana Kapojewski and Steve Levitsky. We understand inclusion to be a multi-dimensional process, not one thing alone, a multi-dimensional process through which groups that were previously marginalized, on the screen, previously marginalized actors, gain more meaningful and effective citizenship. So groups that were previously marginalized are offered chances, opportunities, avenues for more meaningful and effective citizenship. At the broadest level, that's what we take inclusion to be. Second, we really want to highlight inclusion does not just happen in the abstract. It involves political actors who need to move the boundaries between groups, between those who are in and those who are out, turning outsiders into insiders, a phrase that actually Candelaria Garay has used quite significantly in her own work. In this context, citizenship, which is at the core of this, entails membership in a polity. And in that context, it's elected officials and bureaucrats in this book that we're focusing on, insofar as they shift these boundaries by creating rules about who is included, what their rights are. For those of you who know this literature, this is a reference to T.H. Marshall, and how they are represented as individuals / liberal or communitarian ways. In other words, inclusion is not fixed. And so there's a process that we're interested in looking at that has changed over time. Okay, so to do this, we look at three dimensions of inclusion. The first is, as I've already hinted at, recognition. I'll talk about access and I'll talk about resources. For recognition, we mean formally seeing and promising full status as a legitimate actor in society. The important word I want to underscore here is seeing and promising, not always delivering, but seeing and promising full status as a legitimate actor in society with a commitment to protect and uphold those rights. Okay, so I'm going to give you examples of this. I'll come back to that slide in a moment. Here are some of the dimensions that we actually look at in the book. And you'll see there are several of them: constitutional recognition, policies that recognize language, signing on to international conventions. You'll see those are italicized because we measure those three, but there are others that we could have included in terms of the extension of collective rights or the census and symbolic changes. So the first is just to recognize. To include means you have to actually identify actors who might not previously been identified as such. So the first dimension is recognition. The second dimension we look at, one second, is access. And by that, we mean the creation of new institutional channels to influence decision-making. So if the first is identifying the actors, the second is looking at institutions, whether or not it's taking existing institutions and giving access to groups that didn't have access before, or it's creating new institutions and mechanisms for people to gain access to the state and politics in a way that had not occurred previously. So here, let me give you some more examples. Again, the italics are the ones we look at: creation of new bodies and ministries. Decentralization would be another example of an access reform. Deliberative bodies that allow for participatory institutions. Again, Marcela, I know you've worked on this. I'm sure you'll have interesting points on this. It could be many others, but it's about focusing on the institutions that increase access. So that's the second dimension that we look at. The third one we look at is resources. And by resources, we mean the distribution of material, financial, and even legal assets to members of these previously marginalized groups. Again, this is to enhance their opportunities, to enhance their conditions in terms of resources. So the examples here are the extension of social policies. Ojo, I'm going to come back to that. At the same time as other social policies are being dismantled, some new ones are being created. Land reform, labor law reform, amongst other things. So implicit in all of these dimensions, recognition, access, and resources, is an effort to think about how you can enhance the rights of citizens who form part of a polity. As Francisco noted, this is not the first time that this has happened. There was, of course, the moment of labor incorporation that did this, particularly for the formal labor working class. But what we see here is that during the 90s, those rights take new form and in some cases even extend further, especially when we think about social and cultural rights. Okay. I've been working at a level of very formal politics here. So I want to note that this first part is looking at parchment. In other words, what's written on paper, not yet practiced. And so, of course, meaningful inclusion requires parchment and practice, but let me start with the parchment before I get to the practice. Secondly, and importantly, there's often a gap between the two, between parchment and practice, that is critical. And our volume starts off with parchment, but we later return to that gap, which we think as being so significant. And again, Marcela, I know you're interested in this gap between what is said and what is actually done. So I really look forward to your comments, and I'll come back to some of these points at the end. We take them quite seriously. Okay, so that's how we identify and how we conceptualize and measure inclusion in this context. Okay, so what do we find? Why do we identify this as an inclusionary turn precisely at a moment where everybody was highlighting that there was an exclusionary process significantly with neoliberal reforms? So what we did is we took those measures and we bundle them and then break them apart in all kinds of ways. I want to thank Jared Abbott in particular, who at the time was a graduate student at Harvard, who helped to gather this data for us. He's now a Princeton postdoc, coincidentally, and we're excited to have him here too. So what does the data actually show? These are a couple of figures from the graph where we're just counting first the number of reforms along those three dimensions that you see. And what we find is in counting between the 1980s to 2016, which is where we stop, you see across these graphs that the overall incidence of government action associated with the inclusionary turn allows us to identify some trends, but we do so cautiously. But here are the trends. First, we think the onset and the acceleration occurs in a set of very interesting ways. So in the first, you see the number of reforms by year that is disaggregated by sorry, I can't even see my own screen here, by access, recognition, and resources by year. So that's just counting them each year. What you see at the bottom is if you look cumulatively across those years, these are the numbers that we see overall. Again, this is parchment, formal changes, not yet practice. So what do we find? What we find in the book is that in the 80s to the early 90s, again, at the very moment where neoliberal reforms are occurring, and before the left turn and before the commodity boom, in other words, things that we might think are precipitating this, we see important changes. First, importantly, as you see in the top figure, there's a broadening recognition as the first dimension of rights, particularly for Indigenous peoples and subsequently for Afro-Latin communities. This is the dashed this dashed line here. In the beginning, you see it starts to take off on this top. So there's a recognition that happens early on with the inclusionary term, with some access reforms, which is the straight line here in the beginning. You see the creations over time of local level participatory institutions. Now, again, there's some contradictory trends because the formal working class is losing some of these resources, but at the same time, Indigenous groups are gaining rights at this moment. Decentralization is taking off and the local institutional channels are starting to open up, again, as part of a neoliberal process, but still increasing institutional access. However, by the time you get to the late 1990s, you see that the inclusionary reforms start to take off even more, and especially for those resource-based policies that I had noted, especially in the late 90s and the early 2000s, we see an acceleration outpacing the reforms for recognition and for access. And these, of course, are tied in part to the left turn that's occurring at that particular moment. So again, what do I mean by these moments? The recognition reforms I've already noted would be along ethnicity and race. Even though I've written a lot about this, I'm actually not going to talk about that moment right now. Second, access reforms like participatory budgeting, and third, resource reforms like income transfers in play. So let me give you some examples from other colleagues in the book. As I noted, Ben Goldfrank for access reforms, and then resource reforms, Wendy Hunter and Candelaria Garay. We know that during this period, again, building on the work of Ben Goldfrank and his extensive work, but the chapter in this book in particular, that there is an explosion of participatory institutions. He notes, citing Pogrevinci, that by one count, there's almost 1,900 participatory innovations occurring in 16 Latin American countries between 1990 and 2015. Indeed, he would argue that there is an explosion of participatory institutions, whether or not we're looking at deliberative councils or popular consultations or comités de vigilancia or participatory budgeting or policy conferences. There's a new set of dimensions that are being used, again, formally, putting aside how effective they are for the moment. Second, we see in particular that participatory institutions begin as a project of the left. So think about what's happening with the Workers' Party in Brazil. They start off as really a project of the left. Going forward, you can think about initially in Brazil and Peru and Venezuela and Uruguay, where leftist parties and leftist mayors in particular start to implement participatory budgeting in the early 90s. Of course, Porto Alegre in Brazil is the famous example of this. And in the early moments, favoring popular sector neighborhoods. So bringing groups who had not previously had capacity. This starts to diffuse then throughout the world. Goldfrank has written about this, Baiocchi has written about this, Heller has written about this, many others. You see that this starts to diffuse throughout the world, generating citizenship, but maybe in less inclusionary ways than at the start. And what he finds is there's this explosion. It's happening everywhere. There's a diffusion. Even the World Bank takes this up, but it starts to lose over time some of its inclusionary dimensions and potential as things start to roll back, as clientelism, for example, in Venezuela, starts to roll back some of those dimensions. So here's a great example of the rise of institutional reforms, participatory institutions in particular, their diffusion throughout the region, in fact, globally, and then over time, the ways in which they start to lose some of their inclusionary potential, which is contrary to their initial intent. What about an example of resource reform? So here I'll just start with Wendy Hunter. Wendy Hunter talks about, yes, welfare state programs go down with neoliberal reforms, but new programs that those of you in Mexico know well start to emerge to address poverty alleviation in particular. And she's very interested in these income transfer programs like conditional cash transfers. So what do we see in the mid-1990s on? Here's just a list of all of the countries in the region that start to implement some form of conditional cash transfer programs. You'll see Mexico is at the start because Mexico was a leader in many different types of income transfer programs that were in play. Again, there's variation across these cases, but what we see is that they start to reach very large numbers of poor people and poor people who had not previously been included in the incorporationary period that the Colliers talk about, reaches out to the rural poor, to urban shantytown dwellers, and particularly to the informal sector and women in many of these programs in particular, affecting families with children, again, occurring throughout the region in really significant ways. And then, as you can see, attenuating or slowing down after 2012. Another example that I won't spend an enormous amount of time on, although it's enormously important. This is a more complicated figure from Candelaria Garay, who also looks at the range of social policies that start to reach out to outsiders who are brought in as insiders going forward, where there's the extension of healthcare and pensions and income support, including, but more than, the conditional cash transfer programs. And she highlights across the cases, there's an enormous amount of variation, but you'll see furthest to the right here, the bottom right corner, you can see that Argentina and Brazil and Uruguay actually implement large sector inclusive social programs that start to include a vast majority of outsiders along a whole set of dimensions. And since I know Francisco is particularly interested in this point, particularly including social movements who are engaged in that policy making. And since I see you opening up the book, Francisco, I partially changed her graph to clarify the points that are in play here. But the bottom right corner, there's larger and more generous than the next group, with some variation, as you can see, across. What she really emphasizes here is the importance of democracy and electoral competition and social mobilization, creating the impetus for these reforms, but also who's at the table affects how inclusionary and discretionary they are as well. So let me just make a few summary conclusions across this part of the talk, which is when we count the reforms, and then with Garay, when she looks at the content, we see a major expansion that's happening with recognition, institutional access, and even resources. But as I noted at the start, we have to be careful not to overclaim what has happened, because this is happening in the context of neoliberal reforms that are undermining the ability of the working class to do the same things. And so these reforms have somewhat of a double-edged, two-sided kind of dynamic. They are promoting individual rights, oftentimes at the expense of collective rights, with the important exception of indigenous groups. And they're providing avenues for participation and greater resources, but oftentimes those avenues become decreasingly inclusionary over time, the more they spread. And the resources that are happening everywhere are what some colleagues have referred to as low-hanging fruit. They're relatively cheap, they're relatively limited, even though they reach many more people than the previous reforms that happened. In other words, all these things are happening, but not with the power, not giving the actors the power to disrupt as much as some channels to participate, some channels to be recognized, some channels to raise the floor in ways that have been successful, but not in a collective way. So wide scope, but thin inclusion, one could argue. All right, so for the next point, and here I can't see the time on my slide, so let me just check. All right, so I have a little bit of time. So next, I want to share with you how we start to think about what's going on. And here, really, we're thinking about this more as a research agenda because more research needs to be done on this. But let me throw out some things for us to think about. The first are some hypotheses that try to explain why this trend is happening across the region. So not all the cases, but why is there a regional trend towards inclusion that's happening in the region? And here, the first point is exactly the thing that I noted as surprising at some level. We think the underlying inequality in the region is fundamental to the inclusionary turn that's happening because it's providing actors with a motivation to mobilize. In turn, it's providing the motivation for politicians who want to get elected to respond in some measure to the patterns that are in place. So inequality, if in the past inequality led to inclusion and backlash quite significantly and quite quickly, here we see some inclusion leading to political parties responding to that. Secondly, and importantly, this has been a period of one of the longest enduring periods of democracy in Latin America's history, which means that there's been time for the aggregation of these policies over time. Again, it's not just inclusion and coup, there's been inclusion over time through these measures, generating the incentives to appeal and for parties to respond. But again, accumulation over time that had not happened previously. Third, we think the international conditions matter here because earlier reforms that were inclusionary happened during the Cold War. And of course, they also happened in collective ways that were seen as being politically threatening on the international stage for the community that was led by the United States as part of the Cold War. That backdrop of seeing reforms as the lead into something more radical is not happening. It's a more hospitable international environment for political actors to implement these reforms without them being manipulated as a backlash, leading to a backlash. And third, we do see diffusion happening. And here the work by Hunter and Goldfrank highlights that first movers who are engaging in reforms, whether or not it's participatory budgeting or conditional cash transfers, those models are being diffused and replicated in different places as this period of time has ensued. So we think at a very macro level, these conditions are setting the context for these reforms to start off in the ways that they do and to aggregate over time. I just want to show you, if we were to break it down by countries and aggregate all of those reforms together, you'll see everywhere there's an increase in these reforms. This is not all being driven by Brazil. In every single country, although with a different slope, every country is having some measure of these inclusionary reforms that are in play. However, of course, there's variation across the cases. And so if you break it apart, you'll see different countries. You're not going to be able to take this all in on the slide, but different countries are following a different pace, some favoring some types of reforms over others. Mexico is in the bottom left corner here. You'll see that there is a significant amount of variation that occurs. The overall pace of reforms has appeared quicker in South America and Mexico than in Central America, for example. And in South America, Bolivia and Brazil really do stand out for the pace of the reforms along those three dimensions. But we need to also understand not just why at a macro scale, but also why this variation is occurring across countries within the region and across these scales. So here are some hypotheses that we would throw out that we think are worth exploring more. The first is this question of, does partisanship matter? Does having a left government in office matter? We started with that hypothesis at the start. That's not surprising, given the importance of the left turn, and not surprising given Steve Levitsky's work on the left turn in particular. We thought that this might actually be an important dimension. But I want to reiterate, the left turn, once you look at all the dimensions, predates the left turn across the region. Many of those inclusionary policies of conditional cash transfers, decentralization, health insurance, recognizing the left, the indigenous groups, those predate the left turn. Although one could argue that the resource transfers really start to take off during the left turn. So there's something here, but you can't just say left government, inclusionary turn. There's something else that's in play. Secondly, this is where we think social mobilization might also matter. Politicians don't just do things to do them. Oftentimes they're responding to social pressures to engage. So we think social movements are likely to be part of the dynamic, but we think we have to have a better understanding of which social movements drive which policies. It's not all the same movements that are generating all the same policies, and how they create the coalitions to go forward. Third, electoral competition seems to be key here, that where there is greater competition between cases, even where the center or center right is in office, and where there's competition between strong parties, close elections, we think this matters in terms of trying to include. You try to capture groups that were previously not captured, try to bring them into politics and tie them to your hub. Fourth, commodity boom. Lots of folks think that with the commodity boom of the early 2000s, this provided the resources to go forward. We suspect it has an impact on the resources. Again, it can't explain it all. And then finally, I'll just note here, some have argued, and here Max Cameron is somebody who's made this claim, that historical pathways matter. Those who had less inclusion earlier are precisely those that engage in more inclusion later. Think Bolivia as one example. And those who went the furthest in earlier periods, yes, they promote it, but maybe not in the same way as those who are trying to do it all at one moment. We think this is a moment for intellectual humility. This is really a research agenda going forward, because we don't have the answers as to what combination, but we think these hypotheses in some measure will help us understand overall trends, but we need to also think about the variation within and across going forward. All right, so let me turn to the three concerning paradoxes, and then I'll turn to some conclusions, because most of this talk has highlighted all the good things that seem to be happening by bringing more people in, all the things that seem to be generating the aggregation and the inclusion of more people, more recognition, more participation, more resources. Let me note a few things. First of all, there is a paradox that is embedded in democracy itself. If democracy provides the avenue for more inclusion because it nominally makes everybody a citizen and provides the electoral and political and civil opportunities to demand more, third wave of democracy, greater inclusion, so too, this is occurring in a context of, as I noted, extreme social stratification, uneven citizenship, widespread popular discontent. Think the 2019 protests before the pandemic. And in this context, those reforms are happening I'm sorry, I turned to this slide, but this predates the slide. So I'm just making overall comments here that the reforms are happening in a context where there is quite a lot of discontent still, and where three paradoxes are in play. Okay, now we can look at the slide again. So the first is the democratic paradox. Democracy is double-edged. If it provides the space for inclusion, so too it provides the space for backlash. After all, democracy is not about one party being hegemonic, controlling, and moving things forward. It is about competition, and we know all too well, especially from 2012 onwards, that there is the space for backlash, that the very same channels that allow for inclusion can also be used to lead to a decline and a challenge to those very same policies. Winning the electoral game can be used to block and water down many of the reforms, redistributive reforms that are in play. And we know that there is now even an effort and an ability to manipulate democratic institutions in ways that constrain clientelism, courts, media, campaign finance, bribery. All kinds of things are happening within democracy in ways that can distort. So I want to highlight that if democracy is providing an impulse and a space to demand and to be responded, that enduring democracy allows for the aggregation, so too does democracy provide the space for a backlash, which we are seeing happening at this moment, both within the confines of democracy and, as I'll note at the end, even challenging the boundaries of democracy. A second paradox is that this is all happening in the context of, in many cases, of state weakness. And we find that state weakness both creates demands, a demand to have greater delivery of goods that are not being delivered, and it inhibits the implementation of greater inclusion. It does both of those things. So the promise of greater inclusion does not always allow for the following through on the inclusion that's in place. It creates the demands, but it provides an inhibition to fulfill those very tasks. Of course, Guillermo O'Donnell knew about this way, long before the comments that I'm making now, that state weakness can lead to brown areas that lead to very limited forms of citizenship. And so what we find is that state weakness creates the demands, but also the problems of delivery. But it also, as a result, can lead to the rise of these demands and speed their demise at the same time. And the third I want to note is the paradox of participation itself, because by creating institutions at the local level that allow more people to gain access and take part, significant that as we know they are, it over time can also provide channels for the most privileged groups to control those institutions as well. At the end of the day, if you're wealthier, you're better educated, you have disproportionate networks, you can end up populating those participatory institutions and having an influence beyond their original intention, and in ways that can lead to not only the normalization, but also the co-optation of participatory mechanisms. So these are paradoxes, I think, that both generate inclusion and undermine that inclusion at the same time. And I should just say, when you look at all this together, I think the one of the dimensions that's been so concerning is that parties that start off as being on the left and inclusionary in the context of weak states, they too are using state institutions to centralize power, in some cases, in ways that are undermining democracy itself. Think about Nicaragua, think about Venezuela. These are concerning cases. All right, so let me end with some concluding comments, reconsidering advances and setbacks as we go forward. Because stepping back, I do want to remind us, if we look at the broad arc of the third wave of democracy, not just the last few years, but from 1979 on, and particularly from 1990s to the mid 2010s, we do see reason to note and to evaluate significant patterns of deepening citizenship for some actors, whether or not it's recognition, whether or not it's access, whether or not it's resources, even in the context of neoliberalism. But whether this inclusionary turn will deepen is anything but clear, and especially in the years right now, in the moment in which we live. Weak state capacity makes that hard. The push and pull of politics, as we've noted, can lead to backlash in the context of inequality. Violence, which I haven't even talked about today, but I've written about in other places, is also undermining the capacity of citizens to participate in equal measure. COVID. We don't even fully know what the consequences of that are. But what I want to really focus on now is the democratic backlash and the moment of democratic backlash that we're experiencing on a global scale. So I'm sure you folks know this, but let me remind you that VDEM in Europe has been tracking democratic regimes around the world. And their most recent 2022 report is quite concerning. They have a 4-part scale of democracy: closed autocracy, electoral democracy, and liberal democracy. What we see is that democracy, and especially if you look at the yellow highlighted lines, democracy starts to peak in 2012, particularly liberal democracy peaks in 2012, but it declines after that. And they note it has declined liberal democracies back to 1989 levels. So we are coming back to where we were at the early years of the third wave of democracy. When we talk about liberal democracy, the civil rights that allow for freedom of expression, freedom of participation, freedom of inclusion, freedom of the media, those things are being have scaled back to the level of 2012. They note from 42 to 34 countries, and that only 13% of the world's population right now lives in a liberal democracy. We're far from the heyday of saying democracy is on the rise and liberal democracy is the way forward. Not that I ever said that, but many people did. There is a decline. For Latin America, I'm sorry, so I should say the left are the number of countries, the right is the share of the population, because of course larger countries like China and Brazil and India that have had an autocracy or an autocratic turn, Russia, the share of the population is significant. So these things have declined. If we look at Latin America, they do the same thing in this kind of visual. You'll see I highlighted the Latin American cases. They find that Latin America, as a share of the population, not the number of countries, that only 4% live in a liberal democracy. That's the dark blue lines that you see, the dark blue people that you see up here. 84%, all this light blue, live in an electoral democracy. So there are elections, they are being held, they are more or less being respected, but it's not a liberal democracy, it's an electoral democracy. 10% now live in an electoral autocracy, and 2%, according to them, live in closed autocracies. You won't be surprised to know that Brazil, Venezuela, El Salvador, and Nicaragua are really driving those results. And here I would love to hear not only what everybody says, but Francisco, you've worked so much on democracy and human rights. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts here. So this is a troubling time. There's an inclusionary turn, but there is significant backlash that is happening. Some of it is happening through autocratization, but we know that much of it is happening through more nefarious, slower backsliding that is affecting the space for organizing, is affecting the institutions for participation in ways that are really concerning. So we live in deeply uncertain times. Liberal democracy is far from the only or preferred game in town. Democracy is being challenged and questioned and pushed. And I want to note, particularly at a moment where political parties are also oftentimes losing their strength of identity and participation, opening the space for weak parties to sometimes gain a foothold, for polarizing and non-plural parties to gain a foothold. And in a society now that's hyper-mobilized and hyper-connected, where we're getting information and playing politics in a whole new domain. These are uncertain times, not just for Latin America, but for the world at large, for the United States included. These are conversations that we're having everywhere. And so I want to end on a quite cautionary note, even though I started with all this excitement about the inclusionary turn, to say that we need to remain forever vigilant. There is nothing to say that inclusion is on a unitary and upward path. Inclusion can always generate backlash. Vigilance is clearly in order as the media and civil society are being organized, but as they are also trying to mobilize against. And so I end with one of the phrases that was that we have in our acknowledgements that I wish were not true, but it is. Inclusion is not finite or final. It requires ongoing vision, struggle, and vigilance. And I will end there. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Deborah, this has been a wonderful presentation, and I think a tour de force just to portray and to convey the contents of the book. I think that you made a quite significant effort in order to present your findings and your colleagues' findings. I'm going to switch to Spanish for the audience. En segundo lugar, le daré a nuestra querida Marcela Torres, colega de la Flacso México, doctora en ciencia política, especialista en los temas de participación democrática y representación democrática en luchas indígenas locales. Particularmente ha estado trabajando en este tema en los grandes proyectos de inversión en zonas mineras, en donde hay pues estos fenómenos nuevos de minería a cielo abierto, en donde al mismo tiempo que se afecta a las comunidades, se afecta también al medio ambiente, y ha hecho un trabajo fantástico. Bueno, yo lo puedo decir porque lo conozco de primera mano y de conversaciones, no solamente de lo que ha publicado, sobre lo que ocurre, por ejemplo, hoy con la energía en México y los grandes proyectos de energía renovable que se estaban construyendo y ahora están sufriendo una modificación, una transformación. Pero en todo caso, ella también es una de nuestras especialistas más importantes en el tema de representación y participación democrática a través de procesos concretos de desarrollo económico y social. Así es que, Marcela, bienvenida y muchísimas gracias por aceptar hacer este comentario. Así es que tienes la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Paco. Voy a hablar en inglés. Te pido disculpas, Deborah, porque mi inglés no está tan bueno como solía ser. Así que vamos a ver. Good morning to everyone who is joining us today. I want to greet my colleagues from Flaxo and our students from Mexico and Latin America and elsewhere who might be listening to us today. I want to thank you, Paco Valdez, for organizing this talk and for inviting me to participate in this event. I also want to thank the Flaxo community, of course, for supporting this initiative, and very, very especially to Dr. Deborah Yashar for this inspiring presentation, and of course, for all her research and publications that has inspired the work of many young researchers in our region and has certainly inspired mine. Over the last 2 decades, Deborah has enlightened the field of Latin American politics with innovative research and provocative explanations on democracy, social movements, indigenous politics, and violence. Deborah has conducted research in most parts of Latin America in countries such as Peru, my country, Ecuador, Bolivia, Guatemala, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and other parts. Since the mid-90s, Deborah's research paved the way for political scientists interested in indigenous politics, a topic largely dominated by anthropologists and legal scholars. With her research, she underscores the importance of shifting our attention to powerful social movements emerging in several parts of Latin America, demanding recognition, rights, and resources. She debunked standardized explanations that attributed this emergence to globalization, and instead, Deborah made us look at the state-society relations to understand why these movements translated into significant political organizations in some places and not in others. Back in 2005, when Deborah wrote her book, Contesting Citizenship in Latin America, The Rise of Indigenous Movements and the Post-Liberal Challenge, a book that I am fan of, and that remains highly influential in the literature on indigenous politics, the author argued that ethnic politics, a phenomenon that back then remained understudied in the political science literature, could be best explained to a comparative historical approach that analyzes three factors: changing citizenship regimes, social networks, and political associational spaces. In addition, Deborah provided valuable insights into the fragility and unevenness of Latin America's democracies. Now, in the inclusionary turn, a book that I'm enjoying reading a lot, and I have some comments, of course, again, the reader is left with a bittersweet aftertaste. Now, I guess this is expectable. Kapsevsky, Levitsky, and Yashar argue that during the inclusionary turn, beginning in the 90s and accelerating of the 21st century down, governments across the region created institutions and policies aimed at including previously excluded groups, expanding the boundaries of citizenship. The authors provide an encompassing definition of inclusion as a multidimensional concept that Deborah already told us about, which includes recognition, access, and resources for disempowered citizens. According to the evidence presented across the volume, institutions, although not sufficient, are prerequisites of meaningful inclusion. And I think I agree with this, and I think most of you agree with this. Against previous explanations arguing that the inclusionary turn was produced by anti-neoliberal mobilization or by leftist governments, which also could be standardized explanations, leftist governments during the first big dive, the authors argue that it was inequality and enduring democracy what contributed the most to this process. In addition, the authors contend that even while there is movement toward greater inclusion in most polities in Latin America, such movement is not homogeneous across the region. On the contrary, there is significant variation across crises and within cases over time. The authors discuss some hypotheses that Deborah already explained us. And of course, the paradoxes of democracy are considered. First of all, is the fact that liberal democratic institutions were designed to protect the minorities from the popular majorities. And that even when rich people are few in number, their money and political connections allow them to defend their interests and dilute inclusionary reforms. The second paradox is state weakness, which is at the same time what creates and prevents greater inclusion. And finally, the paradox, this is my favorite one, the paradox of participation that shows how even while new and numerous channels of participation now exist, well and educated citizens continue to be the more likely users of these mechanisms. Moreover, even when mandated and subsidized, and when this might be the answer, the author says, there is the ever-present risk of co-optation by the government. In the end, the argument that effective institutions are essential for inclusion might lose, and this is something that the authors, of course, acknowledge, might lose relevance when confronted with the fact that these institutions only matter to the degree that political actors deploy them for inclusionary ends. I wonder here about the possibilities that marginalized social groups now have to achieve substantive inclusion, is as the authors themselves, citing Robert Spossit, movements and organizations are more limited in their capacity to sustain collective action today. Finally, one thing that caught my attention when reading the introduction, and maybe I would have been okay with this a few years ago, and I want to explain this a little bit, is the division between materialist demands and recognition demands. While the authors include in their analysis social groups like indigenous organizations, as they argue that there is a material basis in their demands, they exclude other movements like feminist movements or LGTB groups on the basis of this division, as long as these movements do not posit materialist demands. And here, this is something that Ruth Collier also points out. I'm no longer sure about the analytical value of this fragmented understanding of demands for the purposes of studying Latin America, which, as the authors emphasize, remains the most unequal region in the world. Inequality is not only economic, as the authors also acknowledge, but it is also based on gender, race, ethnicity, geography, and so on. Furthermore, as Ruth Collier describes, the second inclusion was featured by issues related to identity and rights. For instance, the materiality of indigenous demands regarding the control of their territories should not, and this is what I believe now, be detached from their demand to control their collective future. Near 50% of indigenous peoples have migrated to the cities in search of job and basic services. And this is true. They are looking for material demands, but in the cities, they must also face still discrimination and racism. And this has not even been improved, I think, because we focus precisely on the material demands. The other 50% continues living in rural settings by choice or because they don't have an opportunity to migrate. And in these rural settings, we find the most biodiverse Latin American ecosystems. Their relationship with natural resources based on small-scale economies enables the endurance of distinctive livelihood. Indigenous demands include anti-discrimination, and they demand anti-discrimination politics and respect of their living along with redistribution. And this does not have to imply romanticizing indigenous peoples. And I say this because being always afraid of being accused of romanticizing indigenous peoples, I myself have attempted to divide demands in redistribution and environmental identity based or centered demands. But now I realize that we can have better definitions of these demands without using essentialist definitions that tie these people to the past. This has to do with trying to increase the validity of our measures in ways that are more consistent with this group's historical demands. As the literature on environmental justice in the Global South shows, the nature of indigenous struggles is socio-environmental, two dimensions deeply intertwined where identity, resource control, and redistribution of income are connected. If available institutions only address the economic dimension, and we only study and focus on this dimension, we're following the game of the government by fragmenting these demands, by separating them. I can address economic, but the other I cannot. And if available institutions like prior consultations, for instance, only address economic demands in the best case scenario, can we call this a partial success derived from the inclusionary turn? This is something that I ask myself. I'm working to answer this. Years ago, I would have said it was partial. I would have said, yes, there was partial inclusion, but now I don't know. This is because autonomy, which remains the missing piece here, and the authors pointed out, Ruth Collier points out this rightfully, autonomy keeps being jeopardized also by inclusionary reforms and participation specifically. And I think the way to achieve autonomy, and we should also study this, these ways are linked with identity, certainly, but also with the productionist aspects of material demands that Ruth Collier also points out. If we continue measuring inclusion only in economic terms, we might end up validating, for instance, and I focus on indigenous people because it's something I study, we might end up validating indigenous peoples losing their land and living, for instance, in a damaged environment, as long as they receive compensation for this. And with this, we would be again in the realm of assimilation and the elimination of difference, which is something that we supposedly overcame during the second inclusion. And again, I think it is distinction and identity what could engender autonomy. I have some similar concerns regarding the exclusion of feminist and LGBTQA movements. Of course, I'm not an expert in this, but the similar thing, I was concerned about these too, because there are important manifestations of these movements that are directly connected with material demands. The right to abortion in countries where this remains denied, or demands for economic compensation by care movements that sustain a great proportion of the material reproduction of life in Latin America. This is why I find the book very, very useful for understanding where we are today, the explosion of formal participation. That was an incredible finding for me, and I'm sure for many others. And the opportunities this opens for meaningful inclusion. And it's certainly a work that Latin American political scientists must read. Future research on inclusion should pay attention to feminist economies, indigenous cooperative, care cooperative, and so on, as these groups attempt to solve the paradox of participation by gaining greater material autonomy from the state. This is why I no longer conceive these two dimensions as separate. And I think we can do a better job trying to continue constructing measures, of course. We're political scientists, after all. But we could provide more holistic conceptualizations of popular demands than the ones we use today. Well, with this, I want to finish. Thank you very much, Deborah, for being here with us today. I learned a lot from you, as always. Me encanta tu trabajo. Soy fan. Gracias.
Gracias, Marcela. Excelente comentario. Now, bueno, quizá podemos ahora hablar en español, como ustedes quieran. Probablemente, Débora, tú quieres reaccionar a los comentarios que hizo Marcela, o quisieras, y si quieres después de eso, yo puedo hacer algunas preguntas y probablemente quienes están en el grupo de audiencia quieran hacer otras preguntas. Entonces, te daría el floor a ti para contestar un poco. Ajá.
Bueno, yo de hecho voy a hablar en inglés, pero mil gracias, Marcela. Fue excelente y le agradezco por todo lo que había dicho. I'm just going to speak in English. It will come more naturally. But Marcela, your comments were, first of all, incredibly generous. Thank you so much for all that you said, but also intellectually so generative in ways that I think I want to come back to. But Francisco, would you prefer that I respond or wait for questions from the audience? You tell me what you want, because I have a lot to say.
I think that you could go on answering or commenting or elaborating a little more further on Marcela's comments.
Perfect. So Marcela, I'm going to put aside the first question that you asked, in part because I only have aspirational responses about the spaces for social movements going forward. I think it's critical. I think it's important. I think in the aftermath or in the context of COVID and backlash and all kinds of things, I don't know how to answer anything other than what I hope, as opposed to what is and will be. But I want to come back to your collective set of comments about what we do and what we leave out, and then to return in particular to this idea of thinking about what I'll refer to as measure and meaning, and also material and identity-based concerns, because I think it's at the heart of this. So let me start off by saying that I agree 100% with everything you said, but I think that the intent of the volume was slightly different. So let me say why we define the boundaries as we did, but also I think you're highlighting avenues for future research. And by the way, your English is excellent. There's no reason to say otherwise at the start. So when we were thinking about this, it is true, we were trying to think about groups that were not only marginalized, but that were marginalized in oftentimes in an intergenerational way. So when you think about the working class, that's something that affects not only an individual and their family, but oftentimes affects generations to come. The same thing is true of Indigenous people, even if they're moving, as you said, to different locations. That is oftentimes an intergenerational, although obviously also a changing identity. And when you think about feminist demands or being LGBTQ, those are obviously central, but those are not intergenerational demands, and they are not physically concentrated in any one particular place. And so we thought, not that that's not important, not that there's not marginalization. Obviously, there are phenomenally interesting things in terms of inclusion, specifically on reproductive rights, most recently in Mexico and Colombia and Argentina. But we were trying to be analytically clear about the groups that we thought we could identify as being somewhat similar rather than everyone. Although I agree with you, we need to understand that as well. We were just trying to be somewhat modest, and especially as we were thinking about was similar from the Ruth Collier, David Collier incorporation of labor from an earlier period to the incorporation that's happening later. That doesn't mean it's not important, but I think that we had a sustained conversation about this, and it was a group decision of the volume. It could have been argued either way, but that was the way that we kind of thought about this in terms of the geographic concentration, the intergenerational legacy of certain kinds of identities and locations, and in turn, the kinds of material and other sorts of demands that were in play. And obviously, LGBTQ and being a feminist and being a woman are all important axes, but it's not intergenerational in quite the same way, and it's quite dispersed oftentimes, as opposed to being physically concentrated in any one given area. So that was why we did it, but I hope that more work is done in this area as well. I think that the point that you raised, though, about whether or not our measurement has theoretical challenges, because by parsing out material from more identitarian kinds of claims, are we missing something? And I would say yes, but that was a self-conscious trade-off. I think in the effort to say that the folks who are looking at Indigenous people should not only be speaking to themselves, but also speaking in the context of decentralization and also speaking in the context of other kinds of resource reforms. It was a trade-off that we made with as a almost a hermeneutical choice to measure things as a first take, to think about what was happening separately and together. However, I 100% agree with you that if you're going to look at the arc of what is happening, particularly for a particular group of people, to reduce them as separate is to misunderstand how identity-based claims shapes material conditions, and in turn, how material conditions shape identity-based claims. And your comment about centering autonomy, as you've noted, as Ruth Collier notes, and by the way, as I've done in my own work on Indigenous politics, I think that is a wonderful anchor to think about those multidimensional things. I think it's about not just measurement, as you said at the end, but it's about measurement with meaning, because ultimately movements are not just automatons. These rights are not just things on paper. They shape people's opportunities, but they shape their identity and their visions of what is possible. And one doesn't have to be what was the word that you used? You don't have to romanticize or essentialize to say that's what politics does. It gives us identities and meanings, but it also allows us to have an imaginary of what's possible. So I agree with you on that dimension. I think it was a trade-off of trying to aggregate across the region and to bring literatures that were speaking to themselves. But if you're going to go back to look at specific groups, I hope that people follow your call, because it's an important one. That's all.
Great, thank you you very much. I don't know if Graciela Bensustan or any other people following us would like to ask a question. Hola, Graciela, ¿cómo estás?
Hola, ¿cómo están? Bueno, es un gusto muy grande estar en esta presentación. Yo no conozco el libro, ¿no? No lo he leído y espero que esté en la biblioteca y que podamos muy rápidamente, exacto, incorporarlo no solamente a nuestras investigaciones, sino a nuestros cursos, que creo que va a ser un material muy importante en esta reflexión. Yo trabajo básicamente el tema laboral, el tema de la incorporación justamente de los trabajadores, y he trabajado esto también desde la perspectiva de la contribución, ¿no?, de los Collier, y también sobre el tema de legados, ¿no?, y de los legados pues autoritarios dentro de regímenes que transitan supuestamente a la democracia, ¿no?, con toda la discusión que hay sobre este concepto de transición. Y lástima que ese libro termina el periodo de análisis en 2016, porque justamente pudiéramos decir que en el caso del movimiento laboral y de los trabajadores, lo que esperaríamos de nuestra reforma de 2017 es una forma de incorporación nueva de los trabajadores en la arena pública y social, con autonomía del Estado, que es uno de los puntos que se destacaron. Es decir, de una incorporación subordinada, como se hizo a partir de, pues, de la Revolución Mexicana y de la Constitución de 1917, pues una reforma de 100 años después, 2017, inicia supuestamente en el terreno institucional un cambio que yo diría tiene al menos la potencialidad de que sea una diferente manera de vinculación con el Estado, y que tiene por detrás algo que me parece importante, es la potencialidad de la redistribución del poder, ¿no? Es una reforma que tiene esa posibilidad hacia el futuro, tanto de distribución de poder dentro de la misma clase, desde dirigentes hacia bases, como a partir de ello entre capital-trabajo. Es decir, puede tener esa reforma que tiene un sentido muy estructural, ¿no?, de creación de nuevas instituciones con aparente autonomía frente al Estado, frente a los empleadores. Entonces es un reconocimiento de derechos viejos, ¿no?, como la libertad sindical o la negociación colectiva, pero puestas en un contexto que buscaría esa transformación. Entonces me resultó sumamente interesante el modelo de análisis, sus hipótesis, sus preguntas, por lo que vi de una excelente exposición y los comentarios de nuestra querida Marcela, que nos hacen, a mí me dan herramientas, como siempre me ha dado un poco pues, las lecturas de sus trabajos, de Steven Levitsky, de Victoria Murillo, con quienes he pues, colaborado en otras oportunidades, para pensar esta reforma desde este ángulo. Y me parece en este sentido pues una gran contribución para otros procesos que están en curso. Este es el caso, por ejemplo, y pues, yo realmente voy a incorporar un poco muchos de estos conceptos, y visto desde esta perspectiva de esta nueva manera de inclusión. Y un factor que es importante, usted hablaba de los condicionamientos externos. En realidad aquí la paradoja es que es una reforma que tiene un condicionamiento externo a favor de esta reforma, es decir, es una exigencia, como bien sabe, que proviene de la renegociación del Tratado de Libre Comercio, ¿no? Pero con una convergencia con un contexto que yo diría, como usted lo planteó, histórico, es decir, viejas demandas del país internas que se convergen con una imposición externa, ¿no? Entonces, es una reforma impuesta externamente, exógenamente, pero cuyo contenido, orientación, ¿no?, tiene también fuerzas internas que hicieron posible esta convergencia en un proceso en curso. Y solo terminaría diciendo que me parece muy buena su conclusión, en el sentido como de que nada está definitivamente adquirido, pero tampoco nada definitivamente perdido. Entonces, estos avances y retrocesos también los vemos nosotros y los sufrimos día a día en términos de la democracia en México, ¿no? Este proceso de concentración, centralización de poder, cuando aparentemente íbamos a un proceso de también mejor redistribución del poder político frente al viejo sistema político mexicano. Y hoy lo que vemos es, por el contrario, un proceso de transformación, otra vez un partido hegemónico, un partido en donde los procesos electorales que vamos a vivir no van a mostrar alternativa aparentemente, con lo cual es un retroceso desde el punto de vista de lo que la democracia es, que es la existencia de competencia e incertidumbre. Entonces, estamos viviendo tanto en todos los campos estos setbacks de retrocesos, avances y demás, y en el campo laboral aparentemente se abre una ventana de oportunidad hacia una nueva manera de inclusión, ¿no? Una inclusión que está basada, como digo, en un nuevo reconocimiento de derechos, pero también en el acceso, ¿no es cierto?, al ejercicio de estos derechos de una manera autónoma y, por supuesto, con también recursos, no solo materiales, sino recursos en términos institucionales para su implementación, algunos internos y otros a nivel del tratado, como el mecanismo laboral de respuesta rápida. Entonces, me gustó mucho, la felicito, su exposición excelente, el comentario de Marcela, qué decir, excelente también, su inglés envidiable, esto sí, sin duda para mí envidiable. Y bueno, es un placer haber estado en esta presentación. Le agradezco infinitamente a Francisco, a la doctora Gloria del Castillo, que nos invitó y que hizo posible todo esto. Y la verdad, un gusto, y realmente leeré, pero con muchísimo, muchísimo interés, y en toda oportunidad incorporaré su libro a mis clases.
Mil gracias.
Deborah, would you like to react to
Sure, Graciela.
Graciela's comments?
So many fabulous comments that you made. And I hope that we have an opportunity to talk some more. I want to learn more about the 2017 reform that you're talking about. But I want to scale back to a couple of comments that I think you're raising and that speak also to Marcela's comments that are speaking partially to Ruth Collier's introduction. So I really encourage you to also read Ruth Collier's opening chapter, which is fantastic, as you would imagine. If you know Ruth, it's great. And there are other chapters in the volume where people are looking at labor-based demands as well, but there's all different kinds of things. One of the things that Ruth highlights that I think is really important in that work is that there has been a move, not just in terms of who is targeted, labor versus other groups, formal sector versus informal, but that also the nature of the economy itself has changed. The world in which we live and the kinds of demands that are oftentimes being articulated are different. So that earlier round of labor organizing was much more of a productionist-based set of claims where people were organizing around the productive sphere in which they were working, rights to certain rights in that sector and as a collective organization. What she highlights for all the other groups, not the labor demand that you're noting, but a lot of these other groups, is how much of it, not all of it, but how much of it has been, as Marcela noted, more fragmented rather than collective organizing, and how much of it has almost moved towards a post-productionist, consumptionist set of demands in ways that not only change the nature of the demands, but also change the nature of organizing. In some ways, this comes back to your first question, Marcela, and also to Ken Roberts' conclusion to the book. So I think there's a very interesting dynamic of what organized labor and organized labor that is or is not tied to a political party, thinking comparatively, not just within Mexico, but relative to other cases, whether or not they have autonomy rising up or they have been part of a corporatist institution that they're trying to disembed from. It raises really important dynamics, and I think your comments in that score are fantastic. I think the second thing that you noted that I really want to underscore is that, and I didn't say it in the talk because I thought I was sounding too positive, but it is worth noting that we were really struck that for all the movement in inclusionary reforms, even when the left is voted out of power, and putting Bolsonaro aside because he's a particular person, new parties of the center and center right did not necessarily undermine the inclusionary reforms initially. And so you're right, there is oftentimes sunk costs with given institutional reforms. It's not that things go one way and then they unfold the other way. There is movement. And so that's a really interesting political question of when institutions once passed are hard to undermine and when they're hard to implement, but also the kind of chipping away that might happen in other sorts of reform. So I think you've raised a really important point of it's not yes or no, more or less. Sometimes it's about within the context, dynamics within politics and outside to push the boundaries. It's much less dramatic, but it's that politics of that moment that I think you've really highlighted. And the third thing I really want to underscore that you noted, Graciela, is a really interesting point, and it can be double-edged too. But if in the earlier period, as the Colliers noted, and as Levitsky and others and Way have noted, that the Cold War really placed limits on the kinds of inclusionary reforms that one could promote in all sorts of ways, it's also true that in the third wave of democratization, the international sphere was not just more accepting, in some ways, it was pushing for some of these reforms, sometimes as part of a neoliberal agenda, right? So the World Bank pushed things that they thought were going to, that they would pursue. So it was a more supportive environment in that way, but not parallel reforms, back to Ruth's comment and others' comments. And I think we're living in a moment where the international sphere is also showing the power of backsliding. And so, the international sphere is not an opportunity to advance or to constrain. It can be both. It depends on what you can harness, but the international global dynamic since the last several years is an example of what Trump and Orban and others can do. Bolsonaro is also part of that sphere. And so the international can do both. And so I'm not talking about labor in particular, but those 3 points from your comments, I think were excellent. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Okay, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to make a comment on 2 or 3 points that emerged during your presentation and in my reading of your book. I think that the breakdown of inclusion into access, recognition, and resources is a very good one, but I wonder how they relate to some of the observations that other scholars have made about the democratization process in Latin America. First of all, the opposition between the exercise of power as opposed to the access to power. I think that Latin American political pacts at the starting point of transitions focus more on electoral rules than on state rules, more on electoral and party system set of rules, rather than in the exercise of power on how people could control, not only through horizontal accountability, but through diagonal accountability, quoting our loved Guillermo O'Donnell idea. And that, I see that it appears in your work from time to time, but I am still thinking of how the strengthening of social commitments, on the one hand, by these pacts after the electoral transitions, took a pace that enter very quickly into contradiction with vertical structures of power. And even recent reforms of the political systems have strengthened, for example, the presidential figure rather than the legislative branch, or the regional institutions of the exercise of political power. And there is also this gap between commitment in terms of de facto commitments after pacts and after political conflicts that usually got into constitutions and other laws, or in general into law, and the commitment to comply de facto with these commitments. And I think this gap has there is in my view very little research done on this gap between de jure and de facto. Recently, I found a paper by Voigt and Gutmann from Germany. They built a wonderful database on commitment, constitutional commitment, de facto, the constitutional gap between commitment, the jure commitment and de facto commitment in constitutional compliance. And they show when you use the data from Latin America, you see an awful contradiction as compared to Europe or others. Of course, there are, as always, Costa Rica, Chile, Uruguay, and somehow Argentina, which have less separation between commitment, de facto commitment, and the jure commitment to constitutional compliance. But I think that when it comes to recognition and it comes to access to political access, that gap counts a lot in our context. I just wanted to comment that because I'm doing research on this area particularly, so that I was very interested in your work because precisely you also dig into this area on several, particularly the chapter by I always forget
Elkin.
his name.
Elkin.
Elkin, exactly, and who also has built this fantastic constitutional database, the comparative constitutional project, which has fantastic data on constitutional compliance, on constitutional reform, although not on compliance. That's the research that we are lacking still at large. But well, that's my comment, and I just would like to ask you if you want to add anything else before saying goodbye and ending this wonderful talk by you, and well, if you want to say something now.
Well, if I may, I all of these comments and questions and observations are invitations. I wish we could talk for longer. It's fantastic. And I wish that my colleagues who are part of this very thick book, I want you to see how big it is, were here too, because I'm sure each of them would have something consequential to say, whether or not it was the folks working on labor, on the courts, and the like. I want to respond to a few points, Francisco, or I understand now Marcela refers to you as Paco, so you tell me how you prefer for me to reference you, which is, let me take them in reverse order. I think this question of what constitutions are really doing and what they have done is a critical point. We know from Elkins and Ginsburg and others' work that constitutions have become a flashpoint and almost increasingly a political conversation throughout Latin America about what is real democracy and real inclusion and the need to rewrite them. And what we see, and we know from the Andean cases, and most recently in Chile too, they can be highly contested political moments. What those data that Elkins and his colleagues have noted is that constitutions have gotten longer and longer and longer and longer as they include more and more rights. And you're right, we don't have enough on compliance, but what we do know is that the aspirations that constitutions are going to cover everything as opposed to first principles seems to me a really significant debate. I'm not a constitutional scholar. I can't talk about what is justiciable or any of these sorts of things, but I think that a conversation about not only what is in those constitutions and how you build political legitimacy around them, but as you said, also compliance is the key. And the Chilean most recent vote on the Constituent Assembly's proposal is an example of how much, to your point about PACs, people feel that the initial foundations of democracy were not in keeping with where many people wanted to be, how much they felt constrained by the decisions of the transition, and how many aspirations were being brought to the table. The politics of getting that through and the politics of advertising, the politics of saying why this was better than the alternative, clearly it did not work. But we're living in this real key moment, and your point about not just what's in their commitments, but also their compliance is key. And again, I want to reiterate that foundational question of what should be in constitutions, precisely to build legitimacy, but also so that it's can be justiciable is a key question. The other point I wanted to note goes back to that age-old literature, and of course, we're talking about O'Donnell again, not just in terms of accountability, but the pact making and Terry Carl and others who thought about this. I think pacts allowed for more movement than we had anticipated initially when it came to the military. There was a lot of fear that the agreements that the pacts had with the military would constrain what would happen with militaries, and it certainly did initially, although Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have occurred, there have been trials. So I think there ended up being some more momentum than many people thought in some cases, and less so in places where the military has remained a really strong hold. I don't need to name all of them now, I think, though, that this point about the pacts really was on two dimensions. So O'Donnell and Schmitter talked about the pacts as happening not only to bring people to the table, but they needed two things that couldn't be touched. One was the military, as I just noted, and the other was capital. To go back to Graciela's comment about labor and capital, that you could not touch capital if you really wanted the transition to go through, that there needed to be a basic respect for capitalism, not because they necessarily thought it shouldn't happen normatively, but practically to get through the transition. They thought you didn't want to create a backlash by having a capital strike that could undermine the democratic transition. And I believe that this is in part, speaks to the deep inequalities that are in place that is limiting the spaces for inclusion, as Marcela noted in her comments, but also opens up the avenue for pushing forward. So if I could make a theoretical comment rather than an empirical one, this is a theoretical debate that also Graciela noted too, of the degree to which the institutions of the past constrain what we can do going forward versus the degree to which there is movement. And I think there has been some movement on both dimensions, the military and capital, but not as far as one might have hoped, depending on where you stand. And so what we find in our own work is, putting aside the redistribution of lands for the moment, that most reforms have been distributive, but they have not been redistributive. In other words, it has not taken significantly resources from one group to give them to another. It goes back to that old Lowy distinction between, about different kinds of policies and distribution. It's not easy. It's much easier than redistribution. And the pacts, I think, have made redistribution fundamentally difficult to promote. Although hopefully, with space to talk about taxation, which is at the core of much of what we would need to do going forward. So there's so much more to say, but I just want to thank you for the invitation and for the comments and for the queries, and not only for the intention, but for the excellent and generative comments that you all made. I'm going to walk away enriched by the conversation, and thank you for this opportunity.
We would also do. Thank you. Thank you very much, Deborah. Muchísimas gracias. Un placer No sé si Marcela quisiera agregar algo o si Graciela quisiera agregar algo, pero si no,
Solamente
bueno, pues
agradecerte, Débora, por tu presencia en la Flacso. Muchísimas gracias por enriquecer la discusión, por mostrarnos trabajo innovador. Eso siempre nos fortalece. En
Lo
la
mismo
Flacso y en
para mí,
América.
igual para mí. Muchísimas gracias.
Esperemos que la próxima podamos hacerla presencial y tenerte entre nosotros conversando sobre lo que hacemos y lo que haces y las investigaciones a futuro sobre estos fascinantes temas. Esperemos que para entonces Putin no haya recurrido aún a las armas, como dijo anoche, a las armas que tengo guardadas y ustedes no han visto, y sigamos todos vivos en este planeta. Bueno,
Ojalá.
Deborah, muchísimas gracias. Have a nice day and a wonderful time, and thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Un abrazo para todas, todos.
Everyone. Bye bye.
Chao.
Ciao.